Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another NetHope Solution Center webinar. Today, our topic is new tools for poverty alleviation and social protection, and we're welcoming the team from Data for Good at Meta. Before we get started today, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping guidelines for the session today. We'd love it if you kept this interactive during the session. Please post your comments and questions in the chat window for our Q&A and discussion session toward the end of the hour. We'll also follow up with all of you with an email later today or tomorrow that will include a link to the landing page for this session that will have the recording available and all the other resources that you'll see during the session today. And please do respond to our webinar satisfaction survey. Your feedback is very important to us. It helps us make this series better, and it gives feedback to our presenters, and we thank you for your participation. And with that, I would like to hand it over to my colleague, Duncan Drury, who is the lead for NetHope's Connectivity and Infrastructure Working Group. Duncan?
Thanks so much, Madeline. All NetHope members and nonprofits are increasingly concerned with data. This is something that we've seen through NetHope's work over a number of years. It's a very important trend in our sector. But often organizations are primarily concerned with their own data and that they've collected in relation to the work that they do. Public data sources and combining them with your own data has great potential for deeper learning and insights that can inform the work of your organization. I'd like to welcome Laura McGorman and Alex Pompey from Meta, formerly known as Facebook, who are going to share with us information about the data they make publicly available and how you can use it in your organization to help decide where to work, who to work with, and see in general how the human environment is changing over time. So it gives me a great deal of pleasure to hand over to Laura McGorman to give us an introduction into the presentation.
Thanks so much, Duncan. And, I know it's the week before the holidays, and so I appreciate, it looks like we have, kind of an intimate group, but a really nice set of participants across geographies and disciplines. So thank you all for joining. Hopefully we can keep it actually pretty informal and save a lot of time for Q&A. So it's more of a learning dialogue. Again, my name is Laura McGorman. I work on a team called Data for Good at Meta. And I do believe we have a handful of people on the line who are familiar with our program, but assuming that a good chunk of you are not, I'm just going to give a very brief overview of what we do and why we exist, and then I'll pass it to my colleague Alex to do a deep dive on the Relative Wealth Index. So the Data for Good at Meta program has existed for about 4.5 years. It was launched in 2017, actually in very close collaboration with the NetHope community to focus on a set of tools meant to better inform nonprofit and humanitarian response to natural disasters. Since that time, our portfolio has grown tremendously to include a wide range of tools for public health emergency response, a set of tools for sort of economic research and small business better understanding through things like global surveys that we host on the Facebook platform. And especially in the last year, we've been trying to build more and more foundational data sets that are completely and fully publicly available. So one thing I want to make sure that everyone on the line learns today is that we have a completely open source set of tools hosted on Humanitarian Data Exchange. You can search for Meta. I actually think we still also tagged it under Facebook, and you'll see that we have over 200 data sets on HDX alone that you can access without any license agreement, without any particular access provisions. And what we really want people to understand is that we try to make the vast majority of our tools as low barrier to entry as possible. So some of the data sets that are publicly available that you can use right now include our high resolution population density maps, which are built with satellite imagery and census information that provide 30-meter estimates on the number of people living in particular areas. And we provide those in terms of demographic breakdowns as well. So the distribution of the female or male population, distribution of elderly or young are included in those maps. And those are probably the most important data set we've ever released. They've been used very extensively for things like vaccination campaigns, rural electrification programs, as well as water and sanitation programs. Another very useful tool we provide is called movement range maps. These are county level or equivalent estimates in human mobility that we've launched since the early days of COVID to better understand things like adherence to lockdown orders, as well as overall mobility, which can be predictive of COVID-19 spread, as well as economic activity. And those are available for about 150 countries worldwide. Again, fully public, available to all of you right now. The third and probably third most popular data set that's available on HDX right now is called the Social Connectedness Index. This is a measure of county to county, or now zip code to zip code level social connections as measured on Facebook. So it's pretty helpful that we work at a social networking company, which is probably the only way right now we have to measure things like social capital at scale. And the Social Connectedness Index measures the density of friendships as measured by friendships on Facebook across geographies. So that you could be looking at within a country, what's the likelihood of people in Kentucky and New York being friends, but you could also be looking at what's the likelihood of people in France and Brazil being friends. And it turns out that social connections are a really good leading indicator of a whole host of things, whether or not it's bank lending, whether or not it's trade, whether or not it's knowledge of improved seed varieties, which we found was true in Africa, as well as things like COVID-19 transmission. And then the Relative Wealth Index is our newest, very large, publicly available data set that was released in April of this year that measures relative wealth and poverty at unprecedented resolution. And the goal of today's session is to really do a deep dive on that data set. And I will pass it to Alex to walk you through it.
Thanks, Laura. Just interrupt me if you're unable to see my screen. So as Laura mentioned, you can find out more information about our program at the URL shown here. I'm a member of Laura's team who works mostly on our geospatial and maps data sets, and I'm really excited to explain to you how we build the Relative Wealth Index, what some of the pros and cons to that approach are, and how we've seen it be used since we released it around 6 months ago. And I'll definitely be saving tons of time for Q&A, but you can go ahead as soon as something pops into your head, just drop it in the chat, and then our helpful moderators are going to feed those questions to us as we get it. So don't be shy, just drop it in the chat and we'll make sure and get everything covered today. So let's start with the problem statement. What is this data set meant to address? What we're trying to understand is how wealth, and then thus the inverse of wealth, as defined as poverty, is distributed over space or the Earth's surface. And to be a bit more specific, the Relative Wealth Index, which we publish, is meant to be a method by which we can compare wealth and poverty wealth distribution within a country. So this is what the data set looks like. I find this is a good anchor point just to make sure everyone isn't getting scared that this is a really ornate data set. The first three columns, the quad key, the latitude, and the longitude, are just defining what space means. In this case, we're going to divide the Earth's surface into squares. And a quad key is basically like the address of that square, and latitude and longitude is the center of that square on the Earth's surface. And then we produce the two columns on the right, the RWI, the Relative Wealth Index estimate. That's a number between -10 and 10. The more negative the number, the more we estimate there to be poverty distributed in that tile. And the larger the number positive scale, the more wealth we believe to be distributed in that tile. The majority of the tiles on the Earth's surface fall between -2 and 2. There's a wide range of outliers, but very few tiles get to those values. And then we also, since this is a modeled estimate, we're predicting what this might be, we're not measuring it. Our model produces its estimate of uncertainty or error in its prediction. And so that can be a helpful way to caveat your estimates or your programmatic decisions based on how much error we believe is inherent to our prediction in that space. So let me explain how this data set comes to exist. Here's a very simple overview that we're going to walk through in more details, but we're going to start with a set of training data for our predictive model, our algorithm. And to do that, we're going to use a data set which many of you are probably familiar with, USAID's DHS survey. We're using training data from around 1.5 million survey field responses that span close to 70,000 different communities in 56 different low and middle income countries. Then we're going to augment that training data with non-traditional data that comes from Facebook, satellite imagery, and other sources. And we're going to put that in step 3 into our machine learning algorithm that's going to produce then an estimate. What would the result of the relative wealth index questions in the DHS survey be if we had the resources to field that survey in each of those tiles? And then we're going to scale that to a resolution in step 4 of 2.4 kilometers squared. So that's the spatial resolution of each of those tiles that I spoke to you about. So to start out with, we didn't invent a relative wealth index. USAID, since its early days of fielding the DHS survey, it's a very long survey. It takes around 90 minutes to field to an individual household. And a subset of those questions are considered to be usable to define a relative wealth index. So for questions like, do you own a television? Or in this household, are you cooking with wood fires? What is the material that your floor is made of? Do you have electricity? Each of those responses gets either a positive or a negative value. If the response is like, yes, we do have electricity and television, those are positive values. Those contribute to an estimate of wealth being distributed there. And things like wood fires for cooking and dirt floors are an indication of poverty. And you simply sum up all of the scores for each of those responses to that subset of questions. And then what you get is a relative wealth index for that survey response that's a value between -10 and 10. Now, what we want to be able to do is estimate what that value would be, the relative wealth index value, as if we were able to field the DHS survey into any square on the Earth's surface. Now, that's obviously a tremendously expensive endeavor if we were actually going to try and field the survey physically in every 2.4 kilometers square on the Earth's surface. So we're going to augment the existing data with predictions that come from non-traditional data sources. So what we're saying is for a new location, a new tile where there wasn't a DHS survey fielded, we're going to take inputs like population density and wireless connectivity. Let's start with just 2 simple inputs, put those on the X and Y axis, and we look at what the wireless connectivity is in that square, what the population density is in that square, and we're going to estimate, in this case, a relative wealth index value of 1.0. Now, we're lucky because we work at this big company and we collaborated with brilliant scientists at University of California, Berkeley. We don't need to restrict ourselves to just an X and a Y axis. We can add many new inputs and work in a multi-dimensional space for our model. So these are all of the axes that we're going to use. These are inputs into our model that we believe are indicative of predictive capabilities of a relative wealth index value. So we use road density data from OpenStreetMaps, an urbanicity score from NASA, elevation and slope data about the topology of the terrain that comes from the US Geological Survey, weather data from NASA and other space agencies. We are using population density estimates, those same ones that Laura mentioned that we publish on the Humanitarian Data Exchange. Then we're going to use 5 inputs that describe the level of connectivity of Facebook users in that tile. Then we're going to look at night lights if we look at the Earth's surface from a satellite at nighttime. And then we're also going to extract concepts from satellite imagery that describe infrastructure. All of those inputs are publicly available except for those connectivity estimates from Facebook. So you could be building your own relative wealth index version that would make use of most of these and even additional new data sources as well, since most of these are publicly available. Now, the way that I'm not going to get into a ton of depth in terms of the particular types of machine learning algorithms, but a simple thought exercise to take here is our model is going to basically be making a ton of different decision trees. It's going to test all of them, and it's going to withhold some of the RWI values from the USA survey and compare the estimate to the actual survey that it withheld, and then it chooses that ensemble of decision trees, which is both pivoting on both the feature, that is the variable, and then also the value. And you can see an example for just two of those right here. But you can imagine that a computer has the ability to test many, many different features, the order and the value by which it's splitting. So it can test all of these different decision trees very quickly, and then choose those that produce the most accurate representation of the actual survey data that comes from USAID. And then those are the ones that we'll use. Now, I wanted to spend a little bit of time to explain how we're using this satellite imagery to describe the level of infrastructure on the Earth's surface and turn that into an input into our model, because this is probably the most novel scientific contribution that our relative wealth index model has made. So what we start with is this: a cloudless mosaic image from the Earth's surface that we purchased from a company called Maxar. We're going to break that down into those 2.4 kilometer squares that I mentioned before. So you can see some examples of just a smaller subset of that large image of the Earth's surface shown on the left. And for each of those, we're going to train a machine vision algorithm to look at that square and detect very simple shapes, things like parallel lines or lines moving left to right. And then we're going to continue to add them up to make those more complex. And the more complex we see these shapes or assemblages of inorganic lines on the Earth's surface, that is an indication of human intervention on the Earth's surface, either for agriculture, for roads, for buildings. All of those things have a different contribution to the amount of wealth we estimate to be there. And so the more complex the shape, the higher the contribution to the RWI value is. Now, we trained the machine vision algorithm to detect thousands of these simple shapes. And so what we use is a technique called principal component analysis, which I can go into more detail if there's an eagerness to do so, to reduce that down to just the shapes, the 250 shapes, which have the most meaningful predictive power when applied into our overall relative wealth index algorithm. So we take this tremendous number of shapes and reduce it down to a smaller subset that have the most predictive capabilities using this technique. And thus that's what those become then inputs into our model. So the satellite imagery, this variable listed at the bottom here, is actually 250 different scores that come from the identification of increasingly complex shapes on the Earth's surface. So maybe just a quick thought exercise for yourself. Which of these inputs do you think is the most powerful predictive element for estimating wealth and poverty distribution? Is it the precipitation? Is it the population, the slope, the road density, the connectivity, or maybe it's that nighttime lights, the satellite imagery? Which of those? Not all of those inputs are equal. Some of them are better at predicting wealth and poverty than others. Which are those? Which is the one that you think is the most predictive of overall relative of wealth and poverty distribution? Well, the answer is a little complex. This is what it looks like. So the further to the right each of those inputs are, the more predictive power it generally contributes to the overall data set. When we look at the recall scores of the actual relative wealth index surveys that USAID conducted, the blue bars shown are those that come from the connectivity data from Facebook. So we can see that all of those are tremendously powerful in predicting wealth and poverty distribution. However, the nighttime lights, the radiance, is also very powerful. And if we look at these satellite principal components, those are all of those ones that I told you. Each one is like a different shape that the machine vision algorithm either detects or doesn't detect in a tile. Each one of those is a very small individual contribution. But remember, we have over 250 of those. I've actually cut off at the bottom of this graph. So each one is providing this small little additional detail that previously hasn't been done before. And this is called a spatial regression contribution. So It's a very powerful contribution when taken as an aggregate. When we combine all of those different shapes, they become a very meaningful long tail contribution to the overall statistical certainty of our predictive model. So now let's look at some of the actual data. Let's get to the fun part. Here's a map of the Earth's surface of the relative wealth index. The more purple an area is, the more we estimate poverty to be distributed there. The more orange, the more wealth we estimate to be distributed there. And then the height of the rectangles is the population estimate for that zone based on our population density estimates that Laura mentioned it before. Here, let's zoom in so we can take a look at what the data actually looks like in a more traditional 2D view. Same color mapping, the more purple, the more poverty we estimate to be present. And then we're also making the transparency of the square coding the uncertainty of our model's estimate. So if you see an area that's very transparent, that means our model is very unsure. Maybe the different inputs don't agree with one another. And so then there's a large amount of uncertainty in the prediction for that place. So here we see that for Mexico and Central America. Here we can zoom in, and this is the full 2.4 kilometer square resolution of the data set. And you can see that it doesn't take a great deal of distance to move from a very purple square to a very orange square. So this is a finely grained estimate of wealth and poverty distribution that can change very quickly in just a matter of kilometers. And then you also see that some tiles don't have any data available. That means that there's fewer than 50 people estimated to be living in that tile, and thus we obfuscate and remove that from the data set to protect privacy. Here's the view for southern India, Sri Lanka. Here's for Indonesia near Jakarta. And here's for the Niger River Delta. So particularly, I just chose some geographies. I'm happy to dig deeper if people have questions or want to understand what data might look like for any of those places. But yeah, it's always fun to just look at some maps. So why should you believe any of this? Some company just came in and said that they did something very interesting, but how do we know? Why should we trust this? Why should we make decisions as an organization based on this new data set? Well, we've done a series of validations that give us confidence in why we think this is a useful and accurate data set. So the first validation we've done is that we've compared our relative wealth index estimates with relative wealth index measures that are derived from census questions. And we did this across 15 different countries from their most recent census. And you can see the span of that validation data extent, the number of households, the number of individuals, and number of administrative units that are covered in that validation data. You can see that some of the census data is a bit stale. A lot of countries haven't run a census for a while. And this R squared value is generally, without getting into too much statistics, that's how much these two lines, our predicted value and the observed value from the census data, tend to agree. And so a value closer to 1 indicates that they're in strong agreement with one another. So we're doing quite well. This is generally a pretty strong R squared values. Maybe we have some questions about Venezuela here. Let's look at that in a bit more detail since its R squared value is just 0.54. So here I've disaggregated this validation by country. We can see that Venezuela, the census data comes from 2001. A lot has happened economically in that country since 2001. So we might have that uncertainty or that disagreement might be arising just as much from that issue as it is from any issue in our actual data set. But it's certainly probably one of the most difficult places for us to do any validation. And then the other thing that you can visually detect here is each of the square circles, the radius is based on the population segment of that tile, of that community. And so we want to make sure that our predictions are holding true for both rural areas like Lesotho, which is almost entirely rural communities, versus Mexico, where the large majority are more urban and larger centers. So we're pretty happy that we're we're accurate in spanning a range of population settlement sizes and a range of geographies with this validation. But then we also went in more detail at spatial resolution that comes from 2 countries, Togo and Nigeria, that specifically have fielded very, very in-depth and more recent household surveys of wealth in more recent times than those census data. And so here we're running that same test. We're comparing how much the 2 predictions, the predicted value and the actual value, line up. And we're doing quite well using this, these national surveys from those 2 countries. So that gives us a great deal of confidence. And again, we're spanning a range of settlement sizes between urban and rural areas and estimates and observed wealth and poverty in those places. So that's also good. And then third, we've worked with an NGO called Give Directly, which does a wide range of household level surveys to inform its own programming, and using a PPI score, which is roughly equivalent to some version of a relative wealth index, and we compare those, and we're also seeing strong agreement. Now, we released this data set back in May, and so I wanted to share with you 2 examples of how NGO organizations and governments have begun using this data to inform their programming. So as I mentioned, we've worked with Give Directly, who has been working in Togo with the Sina Lawson. She's the Minister of Postal Affairs and Digital Economy in the country. And they have this cash transfer program called Novisi. Their goal is to reach, right now, the poorest 10% of the population in Togo. This cash transfer program existed before COVID-19, but really the pandemic has sparked renewed interest and vigor and donations through Give Directly to reach those with the most need with cash transfers programming. And they've used the relative wealth index to augment existing data sets that are using telecom data to inform where to target cash transfer programs and how to understand to what extent women versus men are the likely recipients of those cash transfers. So they've so far reached around 12% of the population with Novisi as a whole, the entire Togolese program, and Give Directly is helping them push for a goal of reaching the poorest 10% of the population in this COVID-19 response phase. And then the second use case that we've seen is in Nigeria. They have a national social safety net program that also is a cash transfer program delivered through mobile money. And they developed a rapid response register program for COVID-19 cash transfers that was informed by both our relative wealth index, shown here in the middle, the estimated wealth index, in addition to their own national level social safety program surveys. And they've combined those two data sets together and seen a great deal of agreement. You can read more about these with the QR code on the right. But yeah, this is a way to not only serve as a validation, but also inform their cash transfer programming. And we're quite proud of that work. So that was a quick overview. I hope you have a lot of questions for us. And if we can't answer any, the first place we'll ask you to look is in this preprint of a forthcoming PNAS peer-reviewed paper that covers how we build this data set in more detail. You can read the preprint here with this QR code, and I'll drop it in the chat. Or if you're really excited and you want to just jump in and start using the data, you can go to the Humanitarian Data Exchange here, or scan the QR code and download it and get to work right away. So thanks so much and look forward to your questions.
Thanks very much, Alex and Laura. Amazing stuff, and thank you so much for giving us some insight into what the data is, how you've worked on validating it against other sources, so that you can get more confidence in what the data is actually telling you. And we had a number of questions that were relating to that in the chat, so I'm going to read out a few of them to you now. Hang on a second, let me just scroll through there. Yes, so we had Alexander asking or saying that yes, the census data may be conducted every 10 years. I think, you know, in the examples that you gave, we had some countries where actually it was closer to 20 years since the census data had, and also the lack of migration flows, that sort of thing's not necessarily captured in census data. And I think, are you able to, does your data have some idea of flows of people that maybe we can see where people have come from in recent years?
Yeah, our data set doesn't include any estimates or notions of flows. So I should be clear, our data set, the inputs into our predictions, the relative wealth index values, only derive from census data, in that that is an input into our population density estimates. So it would only affect our estimate in our accuracy of our estimate, and that the overall population density might be very far off. And we can look at the relative predictive capability or predictive power of population density can be seen here. So it's one of the more powerful inputs, so we definitely shouldn't discount it, but it's only one of many, many different inputs. So we also shouldn't be overly concerned that it's dramatically reducing things. And the validation side of things is definitely where we would have more concerns. So there's two different types of validation that take place. The first is that whenever we're producing, where anyone is producing a machine learning model, an estimate of a value, that input data, the training data for the model, is USAID's DHS survey, specifically the questions which, when added together, produce a relative wealth index. We withhold a certain percentage of those actual survey responses. We keep that out. It doesn't train the algorithm. The algorithm produces its estimates, and then we compare those estimates to that withheld data. That is what produces those uncertainty scores in the far right column. And that is by far the most important thing. And that should be correcting for any biases in the census, right? Because that is the actual household level survey that is clustered together to produce a relative wealth index value. So it's the strength here is that things like census data really only come into play as one of the only available options for the second layer of validation, where we're trying to compare relative wealth index estimates to other survey sources. So we can do that like we did with Give Directly and others, wherever there's household survey data that can be used to construct a relative wealth index. So it's just one of many validations that we use, and census data is one of a very small percentage of the input that provides predictive capability to the relative wealth index. So of course, I'm all for advocating for more accurate and better population density and census data, but in this particular case, it shouldn't undermine our confidence to too much of a degree.
I think that's a really important point that you raised about bias and being aware of the bias, but also thank you so much for outlining a bit of one of the techniques that you use to combat the bias and ensure that it's not yes, self sort of confirming data, right? If you were feeding in everything, then yes, your bias maybe would be invisible, right? So I think it's pretty great that you're doing that. So another question that we had from Anna, Relief International, was, you know, your definition of poverty. So when you talk about the relative wealth index, yeah, relative wealth, relative poverty, yeah, what is that in relation to?
Sure, so that's a very good question. So each country, all of the tiles in the data set have a value between -10 and 10. And that you can't compare a value of -2 in Mexico with a value of -2 in DRC. Those are very different levels of absolute poverty or wealth. it's the source data and the inputs and our process of normalization across the span of the values. You only are making a comparison within a country. That's why it's called a relative wealth index and not an absolute wealth index. So for example, we would think what we're estimating here is that a tile with a value of 1 has a proportional amount of wealth compared to a value of -1. So an inverse relationship between those. So it's really only a comparison between those. And the tiles with the highest amount of wealth distribution get this value of 10, and the lowest observed estimate is a -10, and then we fill in the distribution between that across. So 0 is meant to be like completely average, the typical amount of wealth or poverty for that country. So it is I think there's some very big caveats that should be made, especially if you're trying to make this a comparison between countries. It is not designed to do that. It's meant to be a relative value to compare within a given country. And it's very simplified. We're reducing down all of these complexities that come in from the input data to a very simple relative measure. So you can think of it sort of like percentiles, right? It's like what percentile of income are we likely to capture within a country if we were to target places that had a relative wealth index of -2 or lower. That's an appropriate mechanism by which to do this when you're talking about within a country. So hopefully I answered the question.
And is there any measure of inequality within, I don't know, within a square or within the regions? Because I think, in an urban location, you may have extremely poor people living very close to extremely wealthy people, and is it averaging out, or is there some way of measuring that?
It's all smeared within the tile, so we don't provide any. I'd say that if you looked at the uncertainty, that might be some directional measure, that far right column. If different inputs are disagreeing on if this is, if there's wealth or poverty distributed here, that will produce more uncertainty in the score. But we're not trying to do, what you can do though is, let's say you're looking at administrative polygons like Mexico City, and you wanted to look and count up what is the distribution of tiles 2.4 kilometers in size. What is that distribution, the histogram of those tiles within Mexico City? That would be a very effective way of measuring the inequality of a larger spatial extent, but not the individual tiles themselves. That's essentially like the pixel size or the resolution of this data set. And so it has some limitations to go deeper than that.
Okay, and a related question, I think, from Sue Birchmore. One of the challenges is that often the most vulnerable and marginalized people are missing from the data. How do you combat that? And I'll give a specific example. I think that some of the data, and thankfully not all of the data, comes from Facebook, but in extremely impoverished locations, there's going to be a lot of people that can't afford a smartphone or the connectivity that they need to use a tool like Facebook, and so the data is simply not there. Like how do you account for that in the relative wealth index? Sure.
Laura, did you have something from the previous question?
Oh yeah, thank you, Alex. I mean, to answer to the question about going further than the 2.4 kilometer grid cells, there's always going to be more granular, but I think really important here is to compare this data set to the status quo. And that's something that I think is very helpful here. So in the case of both Togo and Nigeria, where we had real world applications of the relative wealth index to expand social protection, sometimes people think that using non-traditional data is really just a question of timeliness improvement. Oh, we can get more up-to-date estimates on where poor people live. But I think probably the most powerful contribution of the relative wealth index is its granularity. And so to provide real world examples, in Nigeria, the existing data sets were really more at the equivalent of a county or a ward. And so when the government was looking at its cash transfer program, originally they were taking a look at Kano State and saying, well, this is like one of the wealthiest states in the country, all the other, states in the north are poor, no one in Kano state should be eligible. But if you use the relative wealth index, you actually find, as I'm sure most of you as humanitarians know, you can have very, distinct pockets of poverty living in a very rich overall state or county. And so using the relative wealth index as a net new way to look at where poor people are distributed across the country, they found that there were these neighborhoods in Kano that should be eligible for cash assistance because of that 2.4 kilometer level estimation. So, we're not going down to the household level, but if you think about the data that's available today, because even DHS data gets aggregated up to an administrative boundary, you're only really left with what is essentially a county level average of wealth. And if you take that, from a county to a very small neighborhood, you're typically able to capture a lot more of the total poor population. Give Directly and UC Berkeley published a paper actually that found that they were able to capture, using their big data approach, about 8,000 more eligible recipients compared to if they had used sort of census data and DHS data alone. So I think that's something to be really mindful of. And then Alex, sure, I'm happy to address the question on who's missing, but keep in mind, we're not counting poor people as based on Facebook users. We're really only using connectivity data as a proxy for wealth, and then trying to determine the extent to which that's predictive of wealth, which I think most people combined with other data sets would agree that it is. And so don't think about it as poor people being missing from the data. Think about where we see connectivity for a particular geographic area. It's pretty reliable that that's going to be an indication of more wealthy people living there. And where we see next to no connectivity, the people living there are less, more likely to be poor. But it's not that we're counting people based on the penetration of Facebook users. Alex, I don't know if you want to add any color to that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We're not building this up from individual or household level wealth estimates. It's much more, almost all of those inputs that's shown in the table are really environmental measures. And the absence of any of those inputs contributes just as strongly as the presence of it. So the fact that there might not be any Facebook users or connectivity data for a given tile, that is an input into the model. It isn't that then that model disappears. The machine learning aspect of this understands and takes into account that when that is absent, that is a negative contribution, the same way that a survey response that indicates, no, we don't have connectivity data here to the DHS survey would indicate a negative value. And the model learns that, hey, when I don't see connectivity data from Facebook, and that tends to happen in the places where people report that they don't have connectivity data in their DHS survey responses. And they also indicate that they're dependent on fires for cooking and things. And it correlates those things, and that adds up to the predictive capability. So the absence of data is also makes its way into using this approach, which is in many ways a strength, but there's also caveats for that too. It would be wonderful if we could measure and quantify the degree to which connectivity is or isn't available in a place, in the same way that's easy to quantify and measure when connectivity is present. But yeah, challenges for future versions.
So I think, as I mentioned, at the outset, combining this data with other data that you may have as an organization, like, we all work in locations and have intimate knowledge about locations, and so we have a certain amount of data that we can use alongside this data, right? And then what I'm interested in is how nonprofits and development organizations might combine their data with this in order to really hone in on where the need is greatest. Not just to use this by itself, but this is a tool to use alongside other things, right? So I mean, my question there really is, what sort of skills and tools do nonprofits need in order to do that? Who should we be hiring? What should we be training our staff in order to take advantage of this?
Sorry, did you want me to address that, or Alex, you want to go ahead?
Oh,
Sorry, I
yeah.
lost my window.
I mean, any guidance really on where organizations that aren't already totally comfortable with this, where's the sort of starting point?
Sure. I mean, some of the people that we work with most closely on these sorts of data sets are typically trained in sort of geospatial data analysis. So obviously familiarity with, lat longs, how to sort of match things like ISO codes or polygon IDs to, what that means in human terms are typically going to be, I would say, like the foundational skills required to make use of these data sets. But also our team is available. If anyone on the line is a nonprofit that's not yet working with directly working with our team, I think we always try to make ourselves available sort of a capacity building resource as well. And so we're more than happy to do a deep dive on what some of these files actually mean in real world settings, and hopefully contribute to getting over some of those barriers if you don't have an entire GIS or sort of mapping team working at your disposal. Alex, I don't know if you have further thoughts.
Yeah, I think that's there's one challenge, which is data availability, and we're hoping to fill that in more directly with this data set, but recognizing like the skill gap and interpreting and combining and contextualizing data is just as important, if not more. Our team is available to assist with that, and we also created a tutorial for kind of the most common sort of spatial analytics like combining with traditional data sources that I linked to in the chat. That even if you're new, it uses all open source tools. If you're new to geospatial data analysis, it can be quite daunting. This might not be the best data set to begin with, but if it's very intriguing to you, I'd say dive right in, and hopefully that tutorial helps you get your feet under you. And we're a member of the NetHope community. I mean, NetHope is designed to really be fostering that self-learning and sharing of both the pitfalls and strengths of any given data set. And we really want to be a part of that, and are grateful for the opportunity.
Thanks. We had a couple of technical questions about the data. So one of the questions was around how frequently the data will be updated, but also like how frequently is the weighting changed?
So the data set itself, we haven't arrived at like a publication schedule. So the main limitation to creating, say, an updated version is the availability of new training data. DHS surveys have somewhat continued to field during COVID-19, but it's dramatically reduced. So I think we're not really in an environment where we can judge to what extent we might want to be creating new versions of it. It's not really, and we've studied it. You saw the time span, the staleness of census data allowed us to study this. This isn't a value which changes much over time. Even at yearly scales, these estimates are coarse enough in terms of their accuracy that they're not going to change very much. The inputs which would of those inputs into the model, which do change quite rapidly, are the connectivity ones that come from us, from Facebook. And then also we can rerun our spatial regression, each of those principal components, because infrastructure changes. The limitation there is to get that cloudless mosaic of the Earth's surface. You need to look further back in time, especially in a lot of places where there's a lot of cloud cover most of the year near the equator. And so some of that imagery, to get a day where there wasn't cloud, but the satellite was above it, can be a little bit stale. But we do, we purchase that layer and we continue to update it. And so hopefully after the pandemic's over, we arrive at some sort of, we don't want to be republishing a new version if 99% of the tiles are within 0.1% of each other, right? That's just a lot of thrash. People need to rerun analysis. So maybe after COVID, we'll be in a position to estimate that more, but it's not really designed to be a time series as it is now, but this is kind of our first step in this area. So maybe in the future, we'll try and think through that potential way to expand its utility.
So there was maybe more of a point, because I think you answered the question somewhat, but Celeste was asking about the sensitivity to changes in wealth over time, and I think with the hope that maybe this could be used in evaluating the impact of initiatives that different organizations have taken in different places. I mean, I think we'd all love it if this data could get towards that. But what I'm hearing from you is that there are some barriers to that.
Yeah, it isn't positioned to do so now. It would be I think in a like a classic M&E sense, this would be a way for you to quantify the plurality or distribution of wealth and / poverty by which your interventions were targeted. But you would need to rely on more traditional data sources or other data sources to actually compare if relative wealth, if wealth or poverty changed as a result of your intervention. This data set wouldn't provide that in its current form.
Right. There was a question from Catherine, which I think was more about the data sets that you as Facebook have available to you rather than the relative wealth index. So sorry, Catherine, if I misunderstood that, but yeah, so you asked whether data could be mined to analyze how households in a given community access information. So yeah, TV, radio, social media, etc., to inform the most effective channels to use for rolling out financial literacy campaigns, for example, or yeah. Do you think you have data that might help with making decisions around that?
I don't think we built something specifically designed to answer that question. It's an intriguing one, a challenge to work on. We do have, so the overarching thing is that we have quite a bit of data on where there might be Facebook users. It's not as granular as you might think. Very few. The majority of Facebook users don't opt into sharing any GPS data with us. So it's probably a lot fuzzier than what you might have in your head. So there's a caveat there. When we're talking about household level predictions, we don't have much geospatial data that's at that level of accuracy. We do some of our survey data sets, especially our COVID trends and impact survey, which has been fielded over 100 million times since the start of the pandemic, does ask questions around information seeking behavior as it relates to vaccinations and other health messaging rather than financial literacy. I bet there's parallels that can be drawn. I'm not an expert in either of those two domains, but that's the more appropriate, I'd say, data mechanism that's available through our program, since we're not kind of by default designed to have a deep understanding of information channels beyond our own platform, right? So I'll share a link to that, a really kind of the best dashboard that we've seen built with that COVID survey data in the chat now, and hopefully it provides some value, but otherwise I think I'm kind of just dodging this question.
Yeah, I mean, Alex and I are always trying to collectively come up with great creative solutions to solving our partners' problems. I mean, I think one thing as well, Catherine, I'm not sure where you work, but through some of our controlled access data sets, that if you're a nonprofit or a university, we do have network coverage maps or something called Facebook population, which is essentially a distribution of people who are using Facebook on their mobile phones and who've opted in to share their location history. So again, if you're looking for sort of a series of proxies for access to the internet or the strength of sort of 3G connectivity, for example, we could probably be somewhat helpful with that. But again, to Alex's point, it's not going to tell you things like TV and radio. I think the survey data might be slightly better of a tool for that. But feel free to reach out to us if you aren't yet a controlled access partner and want access to some of those slightly more bespoke data sets that aren't public.
So Eric Cooper and Alexander asked, I think, related questions about the relationship between the current sort of pixels, the current squares, and administrative boundaries. And I think Eric raised a very important point that politicians and policy people, they don't think about 2.4 kilometer squares, they think about districts and existing administrative boundaries. So have you done any work that sort of matches the way people already think about space that they work in?
Yeah, it's so one, to kind of defend our choice to release this at a tile level. So that's to make this computationally feasible, we have to work within a grid cell system. To then aggregate it to administrative polygons is not a super difficult geospatial analysis. The tutorial I linked to above essentially does it lets you, we chose the GADM administrative polygons, which is an open source set that matches very well almost all countries' choices. And we also then provide a weighting according to population density. So those are kind of the two main use cases we've heard from partners who want to make this actionable for especially engaging policy stakeholders who have an elected constituency that fits within an administrative boundary. That's how they think about the world, and that's great. So, hey, how do we caveat this? How many people is this being represented when we look at these tiles? And how do you kind of merge them together and understand the distribution of values within that merger to understand wealth and poverty distribution kind of at a political level. So hopefully that gets people started, but you can go very deep into that analysis. We feel like we're kind of, so far we're providing these sort of like foundational Lego blocks, and then people can build upon that. But ours is like this very kind of unit piece that goes into the spatial analysis.
Thanks, Alex. And I think the important thing the most important thing that you said now was that it wasn't actually that complex of a problem. I'm sure many of us don't know how to solve it, but to hear it said that it's not the most difficult problem in the world is really helpful. Particularly, and also Alexander had mentioned that administrative boundaries change quite a lot.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, it's like not an impossible problem to solve, which is good to hear. We are getting very close to the end. I'm just going to have a look at the last few questions that came in. Okay, I think Danielle mentioned something about, you talked about the input data getting stale, but how about the DHS wealth index estimates the model is trained to mimic? Is training the model to represent an outdated estimate a possible problem?
Oh yeah, we're huge advocates for more of this type of training data to be collected. So if you take away nothing else from here, note, like, we're not trying to supplant DHS survey data. We're not saying that it's outdated and we produce this global layer, which makes it not a worthwhile investment. We're saying the exact opposite. This data is so valuable that if it were more timely, if it was more representative, it can fuel a lot more predictive capabilities. And so we would be the strongest proponents of getting fresher and a larger volume of data. And we would also be eager in adding to like the corpus of understanding as to make sure that that data is privacy protective. Because then anything that carries forward from that data in terms of predictions such as ours, would it be inherently privacy protected as well when done properly. So we are in no way trying to supplant traditional data. We're trying to augment it, and we want to be very, very transparent at both a technical and a programmatic level as to the caveats and the biases that exist within this data set. The staleness of DHS survey is by far the thing that undermines our predictions the most. We're only as good, any model is only as good as its training data and it's the other inputs that it relies upon to make predictions. So we're strong advocates for that. Well, and I mean, the world as a whole benefits from this data tremendously. So we're definitely not trying to replace it.
Fantastic.
Yeah, and at the same time, one thing I would say is, we got feedback when we were submitting this work to peer-reviewed publications about, oh, what if a DHS is, 10 years old? And so we did actually take a look at the accuracy of the model when we just used recent DHS, and it didn't go up significantly. So as much as we want more than anybody to have more up-to-date DHS data, including it from 10 years ago doesn't actually seem to undermine the performance of the model, which is good news. So equal parts fear and kind of, I guess, reassurance that goes with that finding.
Great. Look, so thank you so much. I think the last question really. So thank you so much for telling us about this data set and giving us some inspiration on how it can be used. and also pointing to some resources where you can get hold of the data itself and learn about different ways of using it, like some tutorials. But yeah, the last question I think would be, how do people go the next step? How do they, where should they come to you to ask questions and explore together how they can use this data?
Yeah, sure. I'll just drop the easiest thing to make sure we've got dropping my email in the chat there. Our program website, I'm dropping the URL there now. We have around 25 different data sets, and for those that are publicly available, you get a link to them. For those that require a data license agreement, there's a short form to complete. Any NetHope member, this should be pretty trivial, can usually be done in a day or so. And then we have a whole tech support system for either in our website submitting requests for help, and then we also have a community Slack where people can and that tends to be the most popular. So we're meant to be available, not just publishing data sets, but this is an ongoing conversation, and we really benefit from your critique, and especially you educating us on the use cases that this data has been helpful for. That's really powerful for us to understand what we should build next, or how we should improve existing data sets.
Okay, thanks very much. And we will make these links available in the follow-up material to this session. So so thank you so much to Alex and Laura for joining us today and sharing all that with us. I think everybody's going to go away with lots of inspiration and hopefully explore this data and start putting it to some great use. So thank you.
Thanks so much. And yeah, please don't hesitate to reach out. We're always looking to onboard new partners to the program. So we welcome, direct emails to explore collaboration, and happy holidays, everyone. Take care.
Thanks. Let me hand back to Madeline for the final speak out.
Thank you, Duncan. And thanks again, Alex and Laura. Really a great session. And thanks to all of our attendees for taking time to be with us today. Please do take a moment to complete that webinar satisfaction survey so we get your feedback and help us make this series a better series for you. Again, look for that email. We'll include a link to the landing page with all the resources and links to more information that you received today during the session. And with that, we want to wish you a great rest of your day and a very happy holiday season. Thank you.